No one expected that my wedding day would feel more like a business deal than a promise of love. I stood there in a designer gown that wasn't mine, holding a bouquet I hadn't chosen, staring at a man whose touch felt colder than the marble walls surrounding us. The ceremony was small, private, quiet not because of romance, but because of reputation. His. I remember the exact moment the officiant asked if I took him to be my husband. My lips said, I do. But inside, I felt like I was signing away the last pieces of myself. It wasn't about vows, or forever, or even the hope of happiness. It was about a contract, one that promised security, money, and silence. What kind of woman agrees to such a thing? That's the question I've asked myself over and over again. The truth is, when you're desperate enough, when life has stripped you down to almost nothing, you start to believe survival is the same as love. But survival has a cost. Even now, I can still hear the echo of his voice that night after the wedding, low and deliberate, as he reminded me. This isn't about feelings. Just play your part. I nodded, pretending I was fine, pretending I wasn't breaking apart inside. I should have known then that secrets like his don't stay buried, and bargains like ours never come without consequences. Because in that hollow mansion, surrounded by walls too high to climb, I began to realize that the lines between contract and commitment blur faster than you think, and once your heart crosses them, there's no going back. That year, I learned that love can't be bought, no matter how many zeros are on the check. I also learned that pretending to belong in someone else's world comes at a dangerous price, one I was never prepared to pay. And yet, looking back now, I wouldn't change it. Because buried beneath the lies, the coldness, and the fear was a truth I never expected sometimes. The marriage that begins as nothing more than paper and signatures can end up changing the course of your life forever. But before that redemption came the ruin. I wasn't born into wealth, not even close. My childhood in rural Ohio was made up of patched-up clothes, secondhand toys, and a mother who worked herself raw just to keep the lights on. My father disappeared before I turned 6, leaving behind only unpaid bills and the faint smell of whiskey soaked into the carpet. From a young age, I understood that love wasn't guaranteed, and money meant survival. By the time I reached my 20s, I was tired of scraping by. I carried 2 jobs waitressing in the evenings and folding clothes at a discount store during the day, while trying to pay down student loans that never seemed to shrink. I was ordinary, invisible, and yet desperate for something to finally change. Change did come, but not the way I expected. It started with Michael. He was the kind of man you notice even when you don't want a polished, confident, the kind of presence that fills a room. I met him at the hotel where I waitressed, when he came in for a private dinner with a group of executives. He wasn't just another businessman. He was Michael Prescott, the billionaire real estate developer, whose name was on half the skyscrapers in the city. I didn't belong in his world, and yet, when his eyes met mine, something lingered there. Not softness calculation. It was as if he'd seen something useful in me, before I even realized what it was. Weeks later, he returned, this time alone. He asked for me to be his server again. At first, I thought it was just arrogance, a man used to being catered to. But that night, after the last glass was cleared, he leaned forward and said, words I'll never forget. I have a proposal for you, something that could change your life. I should have walked away. I should have laughed it off, told him I wasn't interested in being someone's plaything. But instead, my body froze. Because those words change your life were the ones I'd been silently begging for. He explained it plainly, as if he were negotiating another property deal. He needed a wife. Not forever, just for appearances. His investors and board members were pressuring him to settle down, to present the image of stability. And in return, I would receive security, a financial arrangement that would cover my debts, give me a roof over my head, and ensure I'd never have to juggle late fees again. It was surreal, sitting across from a billionaire as he offered marriage like it was a business transaction. My chest tightened, my palms sweated. But deep down, a voice whispered, "This is your way out." Still, I hesitated. The thought of marrying a stranger, and not just any stranger, but a man so powerful and distant, felt impossible. I asked him why me. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because you're ordinary. No scandals, no baggage, no one to dig too deeply. You're safe. The words stung more than I expected. Ordinary. Safe. Forgettable. But I also knew he was right. I was the perfect shield for him because I had nothing anyone wanted. So I agreed. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and fittings for clothes I could never afford. Michael's assistant handled most of it, sliding papers across sleek glass tables while reminding me what I could and could not say. It felt less like preparing for marriage, and more like preparing for a role I had been cast in. When the day finally came, I told myself it was just paperwork, dressed up in white lace. A transaction. A performance. But the truth was, part of me still held onto the tiniest spark of foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, something real could grow between us. I was wrong. Life in Michael's world was nothing like I'd imagined. His mansion was grand but hollow, filled with rooms no one used and silence that pressed against me like a weight. He worked constantly, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, sometimes without a word. When he was home, he was distant, buried in documents and phone calls, barely acknowledging me. At first, I tried. I cooked meals. I decorated one of the unused rooms with thrift store finds to make it feel warmer. I even left him small notes, reminders that I was there, that I cared. But he never responded. The meals went untouched. The room stayed locked. The notes disappeared into the trash. It didn't take long before shame settled over me like a heavy blanket. I felt foolish for believing in anything more than the contract. And then, there was Claire. She was Michael's ex, beautiful, sharp, and cruel in the way only women born into privilege can be. She seemed to appear everywhere at corporate dinners, charity galas, even in the glossy magazines that loved to photograph her flawless smile. She knew about the arrangement between Michael and me, and she made sure I knew she knew. "You'll never be more than a placeholder," she whispered to me once at a gala, her red lips brushing my ear as cameras flashed around us. "He'll tire of you soon enough." Those words cut deeper than any silence from Michael, because in my heart, I feared she was right. The months dragged on. I went from feeling invisible to feeling like an intruder in my own life. The mansion became a cage, its luxury suffocating rather than comforting. I stopped trying to decorate, stopped cooking, stopped leaving notes. I spent entire days curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering who I had become. Bills were paid, debts erased, but inside I felt emptier than ever. I had traded pieces of my soul for stability, and the bargain didn't feel worth it anymore. The humiliation reached its peak at Michael's annual investor gala. I was dressed in a gown his assistant had chosen, shimmering silver that felt more like armor than clothing. I stood at his side, smiling on cue, pretending to be the devoted wife while Claire hovered nearby, her laughter like broken glass in my ears. At one point, I caught Michael watching her across the room, a flicker of softness in his eyes I had never once seen directed at me. My chest constricted, and for the first time, I understood the depth of my mistake. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't his wife. I was a contract, a placeholder, a body to fill the frame in photographs. That night, after the gala, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried until my reflection blurred. The mascara streaked down my cheeks like ink, staining the silk collar of the dress. I pressed my hands to my face and whispered over and over, "What have I done?" Weeks turned into months, and the weight of it all began to crush me. I stopped answering calls from my mother, too ashamed to tell her the truth. I avoided old friends, afraid they'd see through the facade. I shrank into myself, living only to keep up the appearance Michael needed. Every morning, I reminded myself that I'd chosen this, that I'd agreed to the terms, that survival was worth the cost. But late at night, when the house was dark and Michael was nowhere to be found, I realized survival without love is just another kind of death. I thought I had reached the bottom of my downfall, but I was wrong. The real breaking point came when I discovered the secret Michael had been keeping all along, the one that would unravel everything and force me to choose between staying silent or finally reclaiming my voice. And that was the moment when the line between contract and commitment, between ruin and redemption, began to blur. The breaking point came quietly, not with a fight or an explosion of words, but with the slip of a folder left open on Michael's desk. It was late. He'd gone upstairs to take a call, his voice low and sharp behind the closed bedroom door. I'd wandered into his office, more out of boredom than curiosity. But something about the stack of documents caught my eye. The top page bore my name in bold print, alongside signatures and legal terms I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was just another copy of our marriage contract. But as I flipped through, my heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't just the marriage agreement. It was an exit strategy one that had been drafted from the very beginning. Clauses detailing how, once a certain project was approved and finalized, the marriage would be dissolved. Neat. Clean. As if I were a temporary employee with an expiration date. I froze, staring at the pages that outlined my life like a disposable arrangement. He hadn't just expected this to end, he had planned it. Down to the dollar, down to the date. I remember sinking into the leather chair, the weight of humiliation pressing me down. All those nights I had cried, all those moments I had wondered if I was enough. And the truth was simpler than I had ever imagined. I was never meant to be anything more than a shield. When Michael returned, he found me there, the papers spread out across the desk. For the first time since I'd met him, his face shifted, betraying something like alarm. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said flatly. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all that came out was a whisper. "So this was always temporary. I was never real to you." He didn't answer right away. His silence was worse than any cruel word. That night, I didn't cry. I packed a small bag, walked out of the mansion, and checked into a run-down motel on the edge of town. I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, the musty sheets clinging to me, and I realized I had nothing. No home, no career, no dignity, just a contract I had signed in desperation and a heart that had been trampled in the process. For weeks, I drifted. I picked up odd jobs waitressing again, cleaning houses, anything that would keep me afloat. I told myself I would never go back, that I would build something of my own, even if it killed me. But inside, I was still drowning. Then came the twist I never saw coming. It was my third week at the motel when a knock rattled my door. I opened it to find Daniel, Michael's younger brother. I had only met him once, briefly, at a family event where he'd stood quietly in the corner, overshadowed by Michael's commanding presence. He looked at me now with a softness I hadn't realized anyone in that family was capable of. "I thought you should know," he said, holding out a manila envelope. Inside were copies of financial reports, contracts, and internal memos. My hands shook as I read them. The truth was stark and undeniable. Michael hadn't married me just to polish his image. He had used our marriage as leverage to close a billion-dollar development deal. The board had demanded stability, and the sight of a respectable wife had given them enough confidence to greenlight the project. And once the deal was locked, I was to be discarded. But Daniel's eyes stayed on me as if to anchor me to something other than rage. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly. And he shouldn't get away with it. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something inside me. Not love, not even hope, but resolve. I had been silent too long. The next few weeks were a blur of planning. With Daniel's help, I gathered evidence, the contracts, the correspondence, the timelines that showed exactly how Michael had orchestrated everything. Piece by piece, I began to rebuild my confidence, my voice. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had given away. The opportunity came at another one of Michael's galas. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same glittering world that had once humiliated me would now be the stage for my return. I walked into the ballroom wearing a simple black dress I'd bought secondhand, but altered myself. It wasn't about glamour anymore. It was about power, the kind that comes from truth. When Michael saw me, his jaw tightened. He hadn't expected me to show up. Claire, ever the vulture, circled nearby, her eyes gleaming with cruel delight as if waiting to watch me crumble. But I didn't. Not this time. As the night wore on, I stepped up to the microphone. My hands trembled at first, but as I spoke, the room fell silent. I laid out everything: the contract, marriage, the secret exit strategy, the way he had paraded me as a trophy to secure the deal. I showed the documents, the signatures, the undeniable proof. Gasps rippled through the crowd, investors whispering, cameras flashing. Michael's face was stone, but his eyes burned into mine. For once, the mask had cracked. "I may have been ordinary," I said, my voice steady now, "but I am not disposable, and I will not be silent." The applause didn't come right away, but the murmurs were louder than any ovation. People turned away from him, their eyes no longer filled with admiration, but with suspicion, even disgust. Claire slipped quietly out of the room, her power gone in an instant. I walked off that stage shaking, my knees weak, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, I wasn't just a placeholder. I was someone who had stood up, who had chosen dignity over fear. That night didn't fix everything. I still had no clear path forward, no home to return to, no idea what tomorrow would hold. But it gave me something far more important, the reminder that my voice mattered. And though Michael had built his empire on power and appearances, I knew one truth: he could never erase that empires fall. But dignity, once reclaimed, cannot be taken again. What I didn't know yet was how far the consequences of that night would reach, or how redemption, in its quiet way, was already waiting for me on the other side of ruin. The night of the gala became the turning point of my life. Walking out of that ballroom, I felt both exposed and liberated, as though I had peeled away years of silence and shame. My hands still trembled. My future was still uncertain. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't powerless anymore. The fallout came quickly. News outlets picked up the story within days. Splashing headlines about the billionaire who staged a sham marriage to secure his empire. Michael, who had always been untouchable, was suddenly being questioned, his reputation fractured in a way money couldn't immediately fix. I watched it unfold from the sidelines, not with vengeance, but with a strange kind of calm. For months, I had been his puppet, his silent partner in a lie. Now the truth was out, and the burden no longer sat on my shoulders. But freedom is strange when you've lived so long in a cage. I didn't know who I was outside of his shadow. I had been the struggling waitress, then the contract bride, then the humiliated wife. Now, I was just me. And I didn't know what that meant. The weeks after the gala were hard. The motel room grew lonelier with each passing day, the walls closing in, reminding me of everything I had lost. I wasn't welcome back in Michael's world, but I didn't want to be. I wasn't yet brave enough to return to my old one either. Shame still clung to me like smoke, and I wondered if people whispered behind my back, if they saw me as foolish for ever agreeing to his terms. Then, out of nowhere, kindness arrived. Daniel checked in on me more than once. At first, I resisted his help, unwilling to lean on anyone connected to Michael. But he was different. Gentle, steady, never asking for more than I could give. One afternoon, he dropped off groceries and sat with me while I picked at a sandwich, my appetite long gone. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself," he said softly. "What he did to you says everything about him, not about you." His words lingered long after he left. I realized I had been carrying not only the humiliation Michael inflicted, but also the blame. I had convinced myself that I deserved what happened, that my desperation for survival had made me weak. But slowly, with each small act of kindness, that narrative began to unravel. It wasn't easy. I had nights where I broke down, where I stared at the ceiling and asked why I had ever agreed to such a bargain. But the difference now was that I didn't stay paralyzed. I started to move, even in small steps. I found part-time work at a community center, helping organize after-school programs for kids. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay barely covered rent when I finally left the motel for a small apartment. But it gave me something money never could purpose. Watching those children laugh, seeing their faces light up when they accomplished something small, reminded me of who I had once been, a girl who wanted more, not just for herself, but for the people around her. Daniel came by from time to time, never pushing, just being there. Over coffee, we talked about books, about music, about childhood memories. It was startling, realizing how much I craved connection that wasn't transactional, that wasn't built on contracts and conditions. I didn't fall into his arms right away. My heart was too bruised for that, and he respected it. But slowly, trust began to grow where love had once been nothing but a bargain. Meanwhile, Michael faced the consequences I had once thought impossible. Several of his investors pulled out. His board demanded accountability. Claire vanished from the spotlight, distancing herself from the scandal she had once fueled. He tried, in quiet, desperate gestures, to reach me. A letter slipped under my door, a message left on my voicemail. But I never answered. Not out of hatred, out of clarity. I had learned the hardest lesson of my life, that some bridges burn for good reason. Months turned into a year. My work at the community center grew. And with Daniel's encouragement, I began taking night classes in nonprofit management. For the first time, I was building something of my own, not borrowed, not contracted, not dependent on someone else's power. Mine. There were still moments when doubt crept in. Standing in front of a mirror, I sometimes caught glimpses of the girl in the wedding gown who had whispered, "I do," while her soul screamed no. But instead of crumbling, I met her gaze. I forgave her. She had done what she thought she had to do to survive. And in the end, she found her way to something stronger. Daniel became more than a friend. Slowly, carefully, with patience that still humbles me, he stood by my side until I was ready to let love in again. A love that wasn't built on wealth, power, or appearances, but on mutual respect and care. I won't pretend it was easy. Healing isn't linear. Some days the scars of that marriage still throb, reminding me of the weight I once carried. But now, I see those scars differently. Not as marks of shame, but as proof that I endured, that I chose to rise again. Looking back, I realized the irony. I had agreed to a marriage contract because I thought it would give me safety. Instead, it nearly broke me. But in losing everything, I found the truest form of safety, my own voice, my own strength, my own worth. Michael taught me how dangerous it is to measure your value through someone else's eyes. Daniel reminded me that love doesn't demand silence or sacrifice. It invites you to be exactly who you are. And I learned that survival isn't enough. We're meant to live, to love, to stand tall even when life tries to grind us down. So if there's a moral to my story, it's this: never bargain away your worth. Not for money, not for status, not for the illusion of security. Because no contract, no matter how airtight, can give you what your own courage and dignity can. Love the real kind doesn't come with clauses or expiration dates. It doesn't demand you shrink yourself to fit someone else's image. It grows in honesty, in respect, in the quiet moments when someone looks at you and sees not what you can give them, but simply who you are. I walked into that marriage thinking I was ordinary, disposable, a placeholder. But I walked out of it knowing this: I am none of those things. I am whole, I am enough, and I am free.